Hello and welcome to Size of Thoughts, conversations with the Alliance of History graduate students. My name is Jacob Glicklick. I'm the producer of the show. The things you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. All opinions and quotations in no way represent River West Radio. They are the sole responsibility of the producer, guests, and callers. River West Radio is therefore not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. So again, thanks for tuning in to Size of Thoughts. I'm joined tonight by fellow AHGS member and grad student and first-time guest, Katie Seitz.
Hello, Jacob. Nice to be here.
Oh, glad to have you here. So, and thought for today would be talking about aspects of your research, particularly the ones that overlap a bit enough with mine that there's there's common ground that actually can discuss. Though enthralling though hearing me give into the long lectures on travel literature might be. So in that, since it seems we do deal with very differing fields, specifically not least in the fact that you're an Americanist and I'm not, but which is good, which is well that's useful since it means that we don't have to be trying to stab each other in the back in the job market in a couple years. But where they do, we both deal with aspects of 19th century Jewish relations and involving both conditions of Jews and as well as how they're perceived. You do it in the unfathomably you've chosen to study the United States for some reason where I cover the far more interesting British imperialism and again travel narratives in late 19th century. So in that, I guess maybe in terms of specifying a bit more of the types of conditions or perceptions you look in, or even what drew you into that topic in the first place.
Well, my first history course as an undergrad, as a lowly freshman, we were covering some basic world history kind of overview, and my professor, Marcus Pica, he was very interested in Jewish history in particular, and so a lot of the texts that we used were focused on Jewish history, to a larger extent than many other minority groups. So I ended up reading, kind of on my own in Jewish history, and I discovered this General Order 11 from the American Civil War, which we can get into in a little bit, but it really piqued my interest in Jewish history. But basically what I find particularly fascinating is how Jews are conceived of as white, but not white. They're a religious group, but they're also a social, cultural, racial group. Sometimes they're an accepted outsider group, but sometimes they're not. So it's kind of a really interesting case study in identity and inclusion and exclusion.
Yeah, I agree. I think it becomes a useful, just sort of litmus test for that. For any number of things about social construction of race. This semester when we were talking about family and sex roles and dealing as well with race and bringing in notions of whiteness, found that as in some ways one of the more useful or at least immediate recognizable examples to show that Jews were not always regarded as white people. Irish were certainly not. Catholics were not. And in that, at least in the case of Jews, you could argue that it's the late 1940s and a very specific impact of fallout from Holocaust that makes some of the more direct and overt grotesque anti-Semitism no longer as socially acceptable. So the fact that such a recent shift can point to all kinds of other ways. But I could actually the point. General Order 11. Since I think that also makes it for a interesting way in terms of if we're talking about sort of perceptions at the most negative and at the most hostile, maybe including explaining to our audience who might not be as familiar with the sort of Civil War deportation orders as.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just going to give a little quick overview of early Jewish history in America, and then I'll kind of get to that. So basically, starting in 1492, obviously Columbus came over, but also that was Spanish Inquisition, so all the Jews were expelled from Spain, and many found a new home in the Netherlands because they were very open, religious, much more religiously tolerant than a lot of other places. So a number of those Jewish families ended up settling in Brazil. In the 17th century. There was some fighting with the Portuguese over Brazil, obviously, and then they traveled from Brazil to New Amsterdam, where they settled. So those were the first Jews in what is now the United States. So from there, then, there was more immigration, especially from Germany. So until about the 1880s or so, most of the Jewish people in the U.S. were German in origin, and they were Sephardic. So it's a little bit different than the populations of Jews that you see a little bit later after the Civil War. That tend to be more Yiddish speaking and a little bit like lower socioeconomic. Lower on the socioeconomic scale. So anyway, in the 1860s in the Civil War, there were over 15,000 Jews living in the U.S. And there were, some that fought on the Confederate side and some that fought on the Union side. But basically, there were a lot of misconceptions about how Jews operated, especially economically. So there's a lot of fear about black market trading that centered around Jews in a number of the border states. So in 1862, Ulysses S. Grant issued General Order 11 that ordered all Jews from Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky to leave their homes within 24 hours and leave the state. This was explained to me because of fears over black market cotton trading. So within, very quickly after it was issued, Jewish people around the country, complained to the president, complained to the government, and it was rescinded very quickly. But my studies in it focus a lot on the reactions from Jewish and non-Jewish newspapers, and how they framed the Jewish population, and overwhelmingly they sought to portray them as, American citizens. So there's, how can you do this to American citizens? So I just thought that was particularly interesting because, before that they might not have been, or they weren't necessarily perceived as Americans or as, part of the country. I mean, clearly there were perceptions about them that led to this order. So.
Yeah, I think that an interesting way of framing it as well, because it seems that also oftentimes the formation of a notion of citizenship or nationality or group identity becomes predicated on certain types of exclusion as well. I know that in this context, that one of the faculty members at UWM, Lisa Silverman, does work. It was taught in a number of different areas, but is focusing on interwar Austria and sort of like the building of national community through anti-Semitism, through in terms of after the loss of Austro-Hungarian Empire, the sense of like this, all the things that were ideal, that were to be sort of endorsed and celebrated, were things that were also being seen as that Jews could not be participating in, like long walks in the countryside, not a distrust of cosmopolitanism, and again the sort of the sneaky, underhand, money-grubbing traders that becomes common. So I guess in the U.S. context, it just seemed like this particular measure wasn't sustainable, given in some senses, the level of sort of outcry and some of prominence that Jews sort of were able to have with this group. Was there a sense of like that much specific like thought or internal debate that went into this? it seems that it draws a lot on sort of the concerns that Jews would sort of be undermining American economy because, again, they're because they're sneaky materialist, money grubbing types. But I guess beyond that, the other kind of other like structures or like things in the debate that seem to have done it, or is it something that wasn't necessarily being given much thought or like consideration? Even I guess the question like in terms of how much sort of like a rational considered anti-Semitism, or
it's hard to tell exactly, because later on Grant pretty much said that he had no part in it. He just signed the order, and somebody else had written, and one of his subordinates had written it, and he just signed it, and he obviously issued an apology when he was running for president. But I think what's interesting is, and why I mentioned that most of the Jews were from Germany, is because a lot of them were a little bit higher in the socioeconomic scale than are wealthier generally than the Jews that came later, and the Jews that we think of in terms of the classic Jewish immigration to the U.S., if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So there, I think you see a lot whenever there's a minority group that has, middle class status, or even a somewhat upper class status, there's always some suspicion, about how did they get there. So I think that might have played in part to why Jews specifically were targeted in terms of the black market. Because obviously, maybe some Jews were participating. It's hard to say, but I mean, it's very clear that it wasn't only Jews that were participating in this, and also even members of Grant's own armed forces were participating in black market cotton.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to tell exactly why Jews were targeted beyond just anti-Semitism, but I argue that it might have something to do with a little bit of class-based fears, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it seems an interesting subject. So this is the fact. Economies always need black market. They sort of exist to fill sort of needs or desires that aren't otherwise had. So it seems that there's not usually this desire to actually go after and shut down entirely, but perhaps to either go after sort of people that are symbolically associated with it as a way of showing or doing something. Also the connections of class seem interesting, since it just seems like there's often one of the issues of with reading prejudice or overt racism of any group. In some senses, many of the groups didn't actually see the distinction of it. On some level, that's what racism is all about. That it is this sort of this group. It's not just having a problem with this one in terms of this particular Jewish individual that exploited and ripped me off. I have a problem. I have a problem with Jews as a whole, as the money-sucking vampires on people. But it also seems that the distinctions are still recognized. It does matter actually. Whether the communities are sort of Sephardic or Ashkenazic, or whether in terms of our educated in Western Europe of it, or if or Eastern European division is pretty central. And you could say that even drawing some contemporary comparisons with it. There's many people in the country that don't see distinction between in terms of African Americans or what form of it, or or Hispanics. There are the differences that exist between the individuals, for instance, in the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, which is endorsing Palermo's the Palermo's company in this areas now, and the people that were the workers that were on strike. Those distinctions do matter, and it seems that granted, the people wearing the Klan robes and going out of it aren't on some level going to necessarily buy into this sort of the nuance, but more generally, people actually do. And it seems that even people that will sort of, in most cases, be anti-Semitic, might make exceptions for Jews that show the proper willingness to fit in, or that just are financially or politically useful.
Well, that's what I found a lot in my own research. So while their class status might have contributed to them being targeted specifically, it also enabled the order to be repealed so quickly, is because they had a very extensive support network and there were several very well connected people in the Jewish communities, especially in Cincinnati and Cleveland, which were two very large Jewish centers. So they had there are many people in the Jewish community that were high up enough to get this out, get the message out there to politicians to say, this is a ridiculous order, you need to repeal this. And also, from the newspaper standpoint, there were, most of the editorials that I found were very much, these are upstanding members of our community, and they are Americans just as much as we are, and things like that. So I thought that was particularly interesting to hear coming out of this time period.
Because I presume that particularly it seems that the most prominent Jewish individuals would be the ones best able to raise the outcry about this of it, but also a fairly a coordinated effort. I presume something that would have been speaking speaking of in synagogues and both religious and cultural gatherings. I mean, in a sense of is that like sort of how it sort of mobilized?
Yes, definitely. There were lots of rabbis that talked about it. Multiple articles and editorials in Jewish newspapers as well as non-Jewish newspapers.
Yeah. Okay. And returning to the part before, it said like the main portion of the argument is that it seems like less a case of why it's not just or proper or American to be discriminating on religious and racial and ethnic grounds, or is it the standpoint of like no, but we are American citizens. It's not right to do this for this particular group.
Well, you saw the Jews asserting their own Americanness, but then in terms of from the non-Jewish newspapers, you definitely can see some elements of anti-Semitism, but not in the in the overtly negative way. I think we were talking about this a little bit before, but it was these are really model minorities. These guys, they're the good ones, so we can't deny them their rights, So, their right to live in these locations, I wouldn't go so far as to say all of their rights, but, so, it wasn't not like there was definitely anti-Semitism couched in the arguments made by non-Jewish newspapers. It just wasn't, the overtly negative as we think of all anti-Semitism. It was negative, but
sure, yeah. Or even it's about preserving and don't necessarily want them sort of marrying our sort of daughters of it or having public office, but it's not inherently like exclusionary anti-Semitism. It's we sort of do want these people around to in some cases do things like lend money on interest that aren't supposed to religious. But I guess that seems like it's the much larger pattern that as much as the patterns of deportation and imposed exile. There's also ones that, some of contradictions inside Christian Europe and Christian North American economies, at least benefit from having Jews around. And
yeah, definitely. Tell me a little bit about your...
With it, it's mostly looking at travel accounts of Russia in the late 19th century, so 1870 and 1905, and what different British travelers and small presses put out in terms of what they claimed to see in Russia and what they observed. So the usual pattern of this is that they, somewhere in the introduction, to mention that this traveler, unlike all the previous ones, had managed to see past the facade and into the inner soul of Russia and saw its core character, which was usually done pretty negatively. So in that, one chapter is going to be on the perceptions of Jews in Russia specifically, but partly as authors were driven to them, as they mentioned them in passing, as they did them largely in the context of the Pale of settlement, and was now Eastern Poland in this period, and partly I think I'm finding the representation of Jews is a way of often beating the Russians over the head with it. You find a lot of ones that go like, alas, these in terms of poor, in terms of poor communities that are constantly persecuted and surrounded by these violent, drunken, superstitious peasants. Surely this shows the immense damage and violence and oppression done by Russia. And in some cases they would then say, and therefore that's why we need a more military spending in order to combat. Stop me if this sounds familiar, but to combat combat Russian power and prevent them from extending their oppressive rule. Other cases just more of like, wow, let's looking at it to recognize how terrible Russia is, all of it. Actually, and one of the things also doing the process is looks at femininity and gender discourse within it, which I think might, connecting back, and I guess wonder, if both within General Order 11, the rationalization for it, the arguments against it, does that play on issues of gender at all? It seems it's talking about Jews in the context of either being dangerous to the American economy because of the black market, or useful because as good citizens that are able to contribute, it's doing them in the role of public commerce of masculine guards. Is that generally the case?
There's not too much gender stuff, but they a lot of the editorials and the articles written, to defend Jews kind of mentions their establishment in the community as families. So, presumably, the men with wives and children contributing to the community. But there's kind of an absence of mention of gender. It's just presumed. It's always presumed male involvement in the black market. But then expelling them obviously affects not only the men in the community, but also the women and the children and the families. But there is some dialogue about how Jews contribute to the community as a family unit. So that ties in a little bit with gender, but it's not too gender specific.
Yeah, it seems like it's not entirely dissimilar, although in separate contexts. Since something there's known sources are looked at. Tendency for scholars, even people that are talking favorably about Jews as a whole, to not say terribly nice things about Jewish men. It's sort of accepted as like necessary evil, or a few different writers maybe claim that yes, these are kind of repulsive people, but even more repulsive is the violence done against them. But it's when they make a point of talking about the Jewess and this sort of figure that's like both it's a victim, but it's also sort of beautiful. So there's this somewhat creepy subtext that goes into sort of like as a kind of quasi-erotic fixation on like how consistently the Jewish women like suffer and are violated and are persecuted and are murdered by the Russian mobs, etc.
Do you find in your studies at all the feminization of Jewish men? Because I find that to be kind of a theme in some of my studies.
In a few cases, in part the ones of it that are arguing that they're, it's for being it's kind of pathetic. If particularly it's ones that are doing the Jews as victims as a whole, then it would be like, this kind of impression that they're just sort of standing around, just sort of being attacked. They're and so some of the ways of the incapability of self-defense, particularly ones that are like just arguing that we need to, white Russia off the map and stop the kind of atrocities that are happening continuously. I think deal with it as a demasculinization, but ones that are like aware of, or like you're like commenting on the sort of the Jew as the lender, as the one who will not be content to squeeze out a bit, but will take the entire lifeblood as much as they can, more ruthlessly than than Christians or even Muslims would do in that same circumstance. Are tending to sort of more. It seems like materialism and direct connection with commerce does really bring in masculinity and kind of like very like predatory, expansive, aggressive. Is similar?
Yeah, because I find that even today in a lot of the perceptions of Jewish people, in America, is you get the kind of the stereotype of a shrill Jewish woman, or like a very neurotic Jewish man, and I find that is kind of related to historical, stereotypes of Jewish women, young Jewish women being the Jewess, but then the older Jewish women being kind of the more aggressive and, more traditionally masculine, and then thereby emasculating the Jewish men, thereby, setting Jews apart as less than, white people.
Yeah, so it seems in some ways like the roles of Jews would be like extended or like hyper exaggerated, and like doubly so, talking with gender of it. So that the young Jewish women who sometimes portrayed as not just beautiful, but as like riveting in beauty, is sort of poetry as walking form of it. And it's constant target is so vulnerable because of beauty. So again, kind of the imperial subtext that comes in this, is with a lot of other colonial areas, is like if only there were more British colonial men that were there to like protect and shelter and also like possess as well. But then I think being in the role of sort of Jewish mother and their maternity is like come beloved, come on, no, you should have not just you've made 5 full bowls of soup, insist that you eat all of them. They're kind of like overprotective. It seems like now, it's usually where comedy
Yeah.
comes up more directly, particularly in playing on the Jewish stereotype, sort of unambiguously builds in, which is interesting since it's reinscribing and sort of even more reinforcing like connection of Jewish women as defined and as both defining and like having more power and suggesting maybe even sort of as emasculating of Jewish men, but also within the home, but also as defined by it and as existing as a sort of like the hyper mother, the over the top mother, like literally.
It seems like a lot of your work deals with, obviously, because it's the late 19th century, it seems like it deals a lot more with like Ashkenazi Jews, which is interesting because around the time that you're studying is when the massive, Jewish immigration, about 2 million Jews, came over to the U.S., obviously related to problems in Eastern Europe, persecution.
Yeah.
So I just find that interesting. So a lot of the, I think the perceptions that people have of the historical Jewish population in the U.S. comes from this time period. You think of like New York, but New York wasn't as big of a Jewish population center until this period. I mean, there were consistently Jews in New York before that, but New York as a Jewish space didn't really come about until the 1880s or thereabouts with this massive population.
True, and it's also, particularly the case just sort of like both temporally and like regionally, since focusing on authors that are traveling through Russian Empire. They've become more aware, and in some cases are like explicitly commenting that when we hear about these different pogroms and violence that happens in Russia, loosely paraphrasing Frederick Bryce at this point, that we shouldn't think that they're dealing with the same kind of Jews as we are. It's not the sort of like sophisticated sort of cultured literate ones. Instead it's the Eastern European savages. So that Russians don't particularly want them in their country. We don't particularly want them in our country as well. So occasionally there's like a direct commentary made on relation to immigration quotas of maintaining them, and that's why I find there's like the hidden like rub or the sort of like the proof of hypocrisy or imperial subtext of this is that even the travelers that most eloquently describe sort of the terrible suffering happens almost never join that with like things like, and that's why we should relax immigration quotas and sort of allow them to settle more in Britain where they will not be persecuted and contribute to government society. They're in some ways I think quite content to have that be a Russian problem and as a way of further denouncing and showing the immorality of Russia. And some of them make it pretty direct, like in the sense that it's that there's violence that's happening, but it's being imposed by how exploitative and dangerous Jews are. So in some cases, it's like good that the Russians are doing this so that we don't have to.
Yeah, you see this a similar thing going on in the U.S. in this period towards the end, of the 19th century and early 20th century with the immigration quotas. And I think it's like within this wave of Jewish immigration that you see a lot of the more overt anti-Semitism in the U.S. because I think of class differences, right? Because the Sephardic Jews that had come over previous to this had generally been on slightly better off than the Ashkenazi Jews that you see, starting in the 1880s in these massive waves. And also, whereas Sephardic Jews in the U.S. tended to, spread out and go more inwards into the country as well as staying on the coast. A lot of the Ashkenazi Jews that you see in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, stay along the urban centers along the coast. So it's kind of it's just a different type of population. And the reason that they tend to stay over there is for money reasons, right? They're escaping, wars and pogroms and things like that over in Eastern Europe, so they're not coming over with a lot of money, and then you'd see a lot of the discrimination. Well, they're poor, they're dirty, they don't want to learn English, they don't want to be Americans. Whereas these other Jews, they wanted to be Americans, they wanted to learn English. They could really assimilate with us.
Yeah, you used the phrase model minority before, which seems effectively like in cutting a couple different ways of it. Both as a counterpoint of it against, or a way of further pressuring other groups that don't seem to measure up to that standard, but also even those who might have seen more of a common element in terms of heritage, in terms of suddenly finding that what matters in day-to-day life in terms of how much they're accepted or what conditions of work we're able to have are in some cases pretty stark divides. And I guess the other thing, how much of a afterlife General Order 11 has? In terms of how much are Jewish newspapers still talking or aware of this as a threat that's thrown up, after the fact?
It's definitely known among Jewish historians. However, even among American historians that don't specialize in Jews specifically, it seems to remain fairly obscure. Or maybe, I know about that, but I'm not really going to research that. When I was doing my specific research on this in 2010, there weren't any recent publications. I basically had to use Korn's book he wrote on American Jewry in the Civil War, and by that title alone you can tell it was written in the 1950s, so it was an older text. However, I recently discovered that Sarna is coming out with a book specifically about the order, or he either came out with it or it's out already. I haven't read it yet. So that's good. That's, I think, the first more modern work that has been published on it. Other than that, when I was writing it at the time, there was no scholarship on it. It was very difficult to find anything on it. Works would note it, say, right, this happened.
But not in terms of serious analysis.
Yes, and I think there was a biography of Grant that came out in the last few years that made mention of it. And again, I haven't read that book, so I'm not sure how specific analysis they came out with. But it was definitely after 2010, so there hasn't been a ton of scholarship on it, but I think it's starting to get a little bit more. I think especially as it's kind of one of those, the Civil War is such an oversaturated field, right? But it's one of those things that not a lot of people know about, so it's kind of a interesting tidbit for scholars to latch onto now, hopefully, and we'll get some more study on it.
Yeah, it seems it becomes a striking case in different fields. I'd heard of it in the context of pre-bar mitzvah synagogue textbooks that had for weekly class sessions of it, which is just sort of noted in the context of this didn't happen, unfortunately. It was sort of raised, and it was sort of talked down, and it was kind of the proof that of one of many cases in history of how there can be abrupt persecution come out of nowhere, which seem to at least have some of these subtext, and that is why we need a strong state of Israel as the only way that can protect our efforts. So I would certainly think that there's a degree of politics and I think retro nationalism used to sort of bring attention to this as I guess. In terms of the emphasis among seems even communities that are are exceptionally assimilated, that we shouldn't be too assimilated or too complacent, or this could happen anywhere at any time.
Yeah, and I think largely within the time period after it happened, there was an editorial written, kind of reminding the Jewish community about it during Grant's, campaign, and I know he, made a specific apology about it. But I think it was generally kind of, okay, he's sorry, we're moving on. Obviously it's been mentioned, but it's kind of, I think, downplayed in American history. And obviously it's not on the same scale as, say, the Japanese internment or, any of the Native American, populations, any of that, it's not on that same scale, but it's still something that I think is worth mentioning, especially because I think the study of the Jewish population in America before the turn of the century it's really limited, and I think people don't. Until I kind of started researching this topic, and I went to a good high school and everything. I didn't really think about Jews being in the U.S. until the turn of the century. So I know they've been here since the 17th century, or even a little bit earlier than that. So.
Yeah, early 19th century American, early U.S. history isn't by any means a strong point. But I get sort of the impression that there's a degree of fragmentation that happens. More so even than with most other historians. That you have the cluster around Civil War, which gets read in terms of either military history, biographies of people involved, or in terms of focus on political currents, on race relations, on changing economic trends. In terms of have the sort of the story of different immigration, different industrialization, and social impacts of that, and then you have sort of the focus of on specific communities, so that in terms of Jewish American, Polish American, etc., you have that kind of narrative, or at least noting of main elements, but there's not always that much interplay among them. Is that a fair generalization?
I think so. I think it's that's definitely fair. And one thing I like to think about in terms of this order and its impact is, I think part of the reason that it was so denounced immediately by both, obviously by Jews, but also by non-Jews, is because it was during a wartime, right? So they need that solidarity within the Union cause. They need to make sure everyone's focusing on being an American, being on the right side, But you have to wonder, obviously I don't think this would have happened outside of a wartime, but if you think about it, would the reaction have been the same outside of a wartime situation? Would non-Jewish people have framed Jews as Americans in the same way? Obviously it's all speculative and there's no way of knowing, but it's something that's worth thinking about in terms of that period.
Yeah, it seemed context of connectingness, or figuring out the law, which stories, which other histories it could be connected to, or should be sort of attached to. Wondering in terms of how much as a precedent, or dramatization of other contexts. I don't even say increasing racialization of the U.S. states, since it's always been extremely racist, and arguably in its earliest context even more overtly genocidal. But it seems that some of the development in late 19th and into 20th century become a kind of differing kind of logic. Aimed at the paranoia of Chinese immigration, especially connecting with wartime experience. Thinking of the 1920s, which rode off after World War I, and sort of loyalty programs and emphasis on not being 100% American, which then led, among other things, the rebirth of the Klan on an even larger scale. And then I don't know. The focus on both, keeping outsiders and sort of with their dangerous communist, anarchist or ideas, or just with their dangerous, ways of life, or in some contexts, their dangerous Catholicism. It seems there's a lot of different, very specific and weird different paranoias that are kind of odd, that overlap in some strange ways. But the common logic is that that there should be a even more overt focus on whiteness in American community, and that and kind of the need for either active terrorist violence, or what seems even more effective bureaucracy, that the Operation Wetback in the early 50s that can just on a much in a sense accomplish some of the shifting of unwanted elements in a greater level than the greater scale than the Klan ever dreamed on of. I don't know. Does that feel like a monologue with the pretense of being a question? But I guess the actual question would be, does it seem like that connects to a kind of the common elements of General Order 11, or kind of this sort of brought up but quickly quashed exclusionary aspect?
I definitely agree. I think with what you're saying. I think that Americans like to think of ourselves as not anti-Semitic because we happen to be on the quote-unquote right side of World War II, and we weren't the ones perpetrating the Holocaust, so we must be the good guys and we must be completely anti-Semitic. But even even within the army at the time, there was lots of anti-Semitism. So I think it's kind of one of those aspects of American life that people are less aware of, but I think it's definitely a factor. Maybe less so in the last few decades, but it's definitely still there.
Yeah, and it's still, I mean, it's part of the own heritage or background that have kind of carefully forgotten, or I mean, I'm thinking in the context of course, I mean, the Civil War is so oversaturated in many ways. I mean, even people who wouldn't take a history class or if they had to take a history class wouldn't like it, will still read up fairly extensively on either World War II or Civil War. I mean, that's what we say when we say history buffs. We mean people that know a lot about the Civil War or World War II. But in that context, I mean, it seems that that it's just emphasizes, I guess, how selective much of that is, or how military or campaign focused. Or put another way, I doubt the new Spielberg movie on Lincoln would find time for this incident.
Yeah, you definitely see that. I mean, that's obviously not the case across the board. It might be the case that you'd find more, amateur historians of the Civil War know about General Order 11 than, professional historians. But I think generally, in the amateur setting, is definitely World War II and the Civil War, and it's the military campaigns aspect of it, which is not bad necessarily, but it tends to neglect other groups and other factors outside of just who fought what battle where and who won.
Yeah, and I think bringing that, or why those kind of patterns occur, can be kind of interesting. I think it was way back of it, fourth episode of the show or something or so, that talked with Joseph Walzer, as well as Jason Kennedy from Boswell Books, in the context of what kind of history books were actually being bought and sold, and what kind of ones members of public were generally drawn towards, and what kind of those patterns get sort of overlooked. Which, I mean, it seems that, well, I mean, at some level, I mean, it's not a huge surprise, or that it wouldn't be about kind of rubbing our noses in the grimmer, more destructive side of any given conflict. But also, I mean, it seems that it's not even just a matter of individual choice of people who look at the given, go out and look at the shelves, in terms of see the book that's is the kind that is this sort of more complex, perhaps darker, more sort of morally ambiguous tale of own nationalist background, and choose the other one. And I think in most cases it's not seeing the option of that either way.
But I definitely see a window for General Order 11 specifically to kind of blow up in terms of the popular history scene, in that it's, like I mentioned before, it's this little known part of the Civil War, and it had a major player, Ulysses S. Grant, as part of it. So, I mean, it definitely has the potential for, more popular history focus.
Yeah, I think, I mean, also, in the sense of not just, I guess, awareness of it in itself doing it, but awareness of it in the proper context. Yeah. Since, I mean, I'm not going to say that in terms of I think they're Jewish American has too much emphasis on it, since, I mean, in some cases, any facts that know about, in the past, even if they're comparatively minor ones, are still sort of useful. But I mean, I do think that the way that it just referencing it in the context of long aspects of persecution and marginalization becomes deeply ahistorical. I mean, you
can take it out of,
Yeah.
it would be less effective to take it out of the context of, historical anti-Semitism up until that point.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that, as suggested before, I mean, some of the strands to connect this is both with, in terms of other kinds of, I mean, either violence or threatened violence or threatened exclusionary racism, but also in the context of wartime, in the context of, I mean, even by their own standards, that this was, I mean, this is kind of became their own tactical mistake of something that briefly seemed like a good policy, but that they showed by enough pressure of it didn't actually want to run through, which I don't know. again, perhaps it speaks into my own anarchist sensibilities more. But reinforcing like just the danger of society in wartime, the danger to, the country that it's attacking, and and the people it's killing, but also the danger to itself, the danger of reinventing it in sort of much more paranoid, hasty lines of extending some of the forms of control and authority even more extensively, which seems in that context of the formation of building on own information and concern and marginalization in a way that, as with any deportation, it threatens, a vast amount of damage to people's lives.
And up until this point, we've only been talking about, Jews as a social, cultural, racial group, but there's also the religious aspect, and I don't think we have time to really get into that. But there's definitely, implications of, and this anti-Semitism in terms of religious freedom and freedom to exercise. And you can kind of see some parallels, with the situation, since 9/11 with Muslims and things like that. So there's definitely other, implications beyond just racial, cultural, socioeconomic, but also religious.
Right. Yeah. It seems that it gets drawn in enough that, particularly, any group of people, seems like it touches all the aspects of it. In terms of with gender, within race, with religion, either that's in terms of seen as something, in terms of access to that as part of heritage that needs to be protected, or just the extent to which any nationalist policy and any militarist policy will be vindicated as being divinely blessed. Particularly, not necessarily true for all societies equally, but certainly in the United States. You can't make, in terms of State of the Union or any given campaign on national level without without taking out sort of your God credentials and waving them as aggressively as possible.
Yeah, today obviously, but also in the Civil War context, you saw a lot of rabbis even on both sides preaching that God had divined their side in particular to be the winners of the Civil War. But
yeah, is the Civil War where the Battle Hymn of the Republic emerges from?
I believe so, but I'm not positive. So
probably much closer to being positive as you can do it. Yes, actually, I've never taken at the college level a U.S. history class that dealt with the Civil War period or pre-1877. Nope.
Wow. How is that possible?
A lot of European and world history and interdisciplinary run through of it, and again, I guess the fact perhaps that the Civil War you bored me to some extent. I was more of a bit of World War II history buff. Could tell the campaigns and the route of MacArthur, the run through of it. But
I feel like I enjoy, in particular, 19th century American history, but I don't like the Civil War in terms of I don't study the military aspects of it. I couldn't tell you what campaign Grant was on during this. I'm more interested in the social cultural kind of aspects of it, so I guess I'm kind of with you there.
Yeah, I really am becoming more interested in 19th in the British context and connections with empire and some of impact of industrialization, and in with the U.S. Really very close of the century, and just labor struggles, and then ways immigration played into that, which I don't know, it does seem like it becomes the other. Well, I feel I almost need to the obligatory in terms of plug for Marxists and anarchists and anti-capitalists run through. But just even that it seems that
it becomes very important in Jewish American history in that period. Unfortunately, that's not my particular area of study, but I definitely know it's. And
it seems that it's interesting that really, that dimension of anti-immigrant sentiment and the exclusionary racism does seem that it's a later thing, right? Since the time period you're talking about, it seems that the concern is that Jews would be predatory capitalists too much, that they would be like too profit-seeking, in terms of and too good at it, that it would destroy and exploit other people. Whereas it seems later on the notion of, we're talking like Eastern Europeans, as a whole, that they would bring in these weird ideas and these bomb-throwing radicals.
Yeah, it's definitely more economics-based with the Sephardic Jewish population than with the Ashkenazic, in terms of, like you were saying, that they're conniving and they know how to work the system, whereas with the Ashkenazi Jews, it's more they're poor, and that factors in, but also the radical ideas and a lot of issues of they don't want to fit in with us, that kind of stuff. So they're so different, and they're not even trying to be an American in terms of like how we view our narrow view of Americans. So I think that definitely shifts with that massive wave of immigration in the 1880s onward.
Yeah, and it seems in this period, in the mid 19th century, really talking in terms of like either like ideology in a real sense. It's more a question of label of just in terms of labels, or who is given the degree of acceptance, and not even like in terms of tolerance inherently in the sense of like in terms of like rights or firm principles, but just in the sense of respectability of like who fits in, who is both who is useful and who is sort of useful to associate with.
Exactly. It's much easier to fit in when you have easy access to money, whereas if you don't, then it's a lot more difficult to become American in some people's mind.
Yeah, we've talked all this in the context of the Union and the northern areas, but you mentioned one of the few facts that do I think remember about the Civil War and the Jewish connection wasn't the Vice President of the Confederate States.
I believe so. It was
Jewish.
Yeah, it was him or a very a higher ranking member, and there was a significant Jewish population in the South. Actually, until the 1830s, Charleston had the largest Jewish population in the country, and even into the Civil War, it still had a very sizable Jewish population, and there were definitely Jews on both sides. It was slightly more on the Union side, but both had
just because
many several thousand. So.
Right, and just because I guess more. Larger cities, more urbanization. Certain types of, I guess, particularly, I would imagine in the earlier context of colonial settlement and cotton plantations and tobacco wouldn't attract or tolerate Jews to the same extent.
Generally, but I think there was the initial, when South Carolina was set up as a colony initially, the people who ran it were a little bit more religiously open. This isn't quite my area, but that's why Charleston specifically became such a large, hub for the early Jewish American population.
True, and it seems that one other side of this, can certainly, pointing to like the problems of the General Order 11 because it's because it charges a group of it that did it seems in most cases identify as Americans to a large extent and weren't having collective identity or interests that were really subversive or disruptive of that. But by the same token, that meant that people of the South, assuming of it, also were largely identified with as a regional identity and as then good Confederates.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of the rhetoric within the editorials was saying our sons are out there fighting for the Union. How can we not be Americans? How can we not be perceived as Americans? So.
Yeah, which also means that which I think is slightly it points my or criticism or frustration with some of the internal Jewish historiography of the emphasis of each sort of eternal victimhood. Misses the ways that not in all societies, but in some societies, including more, comparatively more recently, with certain notable exceptions. Jews did have, were not always as the most persecuted group, or they did have areas of control, over others. I think I'm building to some episode that's like deliberate, that's focusing on Israel and criticism of it, but perhaps another time of it.
I have no comments on that.
Thank Katie. Thanks very much for doing this. And
Thank you for having me.
Good discussion. So then, would encourage to tune in again next week when will be, I believe, the politics of pre-agrarian societies. All right. Till then, this has been Size of Thoughts. Thank you.